Welcome to another episode of The Evaluation Couch, the podcast where we talk about career growth and the field of evaluation. This is your host, Maria Montenegro. I remember that when I started my evaluation career and I was exploring different roles, I learned very quickly that especially outside Canada, there were completely different titles for evaluation roles out there, and many of them included acronyms and different letters that I couldn't really understand. When I was working in the Building a Career in Evaluation page for better evaluation, one of the topics that I delved into was the different position titles and what they actually meant within our broader field of monitoring and evaluation. And as part of this exercise, I actually analyzed several job positions that were framed under different names. And what I learned was that despite having different titles, despite having sometimes the L and even the A of accountability, many of the duties and the skills that these positions required were pretty much the same. My experience has been that even when there is certain words like learning in a job title or in the description of an evaluation approach of an organization, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing or practicing evaluation in a different way that actually promotes learning. And that is why I invited my amazing guest to this episode. Florence Randari is a monitoring, evaluation, and learning practitioner that is passionate about evaluation. She's the author and founder of Learn, Adapt, and Manage Network, a newsletter that is dedicated to help people put into practice the L in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Florence, thank you so much for being here with me today. And I'm so excited for our conversation. Would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Thanks so much for having me, Maria. My name is Florence Randari. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I would say I'm someone who has always been curious about why we collect evidence and what actually happens after it's produced.
Love that. And Florence, one of the reasons why I wanted you to be here, I admire a lot of the content that you have out there and really all of the expertise you share around learning. Learning seems to be such an important part of your career and your interests. Can you share with me one memorable experience you have that made you realize learning is so fundamental and important for the work that you do?
Yeah, I think there is a background story to this, so I'll try and be a bit quick. But my journey really started from when I was growing up. I grew in a part of Kenya that is semi-arid, and that just says we had a lot of NGOs areas. And one of the questions that kept coming up was we have a lot of this staff and support, but things are not changing. We keep like seeing the same problems over and over. In my case, it was an area that was facing famine sometimes and drought sometimes, and this kept happening over and over. And I think that's where my curiosity started of, oh, who are these people who have a lot of money and fancy cars and they're just like around and trying to help, but some of these problems really you don't see change. So that's where my curiosity started. And then I went to college. I studied economics. And when I was doing that, I was introduced to the world of development economics. And it was very fascinating about how we think about problems and what different people are trying to do to really solve those problems. And that's how I found myself in the NGO space. And when I came on board, I started in the monitoring and evaluation field. But I realized very quickly that I was getting a bit frustrated with the continuous reporting, collecting data. It's just like a cycle of us collecting data, writing reports, collecting data, writing reports. And I got really interested in trying to figure out like, why is our work important? Why are evaluators essential in this sector at all? Like, why do we need them? And that's how I ended up really looking at the learning space, because I felt like if we can generate information that is going to be used to influence some decisions, then we are probably doing something good overall when it comes to sustainable impact. So that was really the shift for me.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think what you just described is something that probably resonates with a lot of evaluators, right? Like that doing a lot of the work, but then not really seeing it translate into learning and then into actions. So I really appreciated that. One of the things that I've read in some of the content that you produce, and I know you have a newsletter and you are very active on LinkedIn. One of the things that I read that you posted was that monitoring and evaluation systems don't support learning even when they are rebranded as monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, this is based on my own experience. So I have been in spaces where we, as monitoring and evaluation professionals, or just evaluators, we talk a lot about the transition from whatever we call traditional M&E, where it was purely for accountability, to what we now call MEL and a lot more other acronyms around the space. But what we call MEL, where we are now talking a little bit about learning, but we talk about it as an addition. It's, oh, we used to do traditional MEL, and now we are moving from just focusing on monitoring and evaluation for accountability to monitoring and evaluation for learning. But when you have conversations with people, when you ask evaluators, when you ask monitoring and evaluation specialists, what do you do on a day to day basis? Anything that has to do learning doesn't feature on that list. So us changing our system and saying MEL systems, or changing our recruitment tactics and saying we're hiring for MEL, doesn't really mean that we have made that transition, either as a sector or as an organization or even just at a program level.
Yeah, thank you for that. I remember a long time ago, I made a post about job position titles in evaluation and actually went through the work of comparing male specialists versus evaluation specialists versus M&E specialists. And I would agree, at least from the description that you see in how organizations are framing these positions, that they're basically the same. They're just adding, as you
Yeah.
said, like acronyms and names. But as a whole, my observation has also been that we talk about this position as being equivalent. What would incorporating that learning component look like in from your perspective in a day-to-day of a monitoring and evaluation professional?
Yeah. So I think that really comes back to, what does learning mean, right? So what is learning? And once we figure out what that is and what it means for us as either a program or an organization or as a sector, then we have a list of things that we have to do to make sure we are contributing to that. So, one quick way of saying it from my perspective, when I think about learning, I'm thinking about a process that helps us to figure out what information do we need that is going to influence the decisions that are being made for this program to create greater impact or to be sustainable. And when we look at that process, we are thinking, before we start doing the work, we need to figure out what is needed for us to learn. We need to figure out during the work, what do we need for us to learn? And after the program, after the implementation, what does that learning look like? And very quickly, if I can share an example, I would say some of the things that, for example, I have done in programs where I have worked as the learning specialist for that specific program, although I was embedded in the MEL team. It's really starting to think about, what is our learning agenda as a program? What do we want to learn? Why do we want to learn these things? And that comes back to, we are learning not just for the sake of learning, but for a purpose. So we need to figure out what that purpose is. So the first thing is really thinking about the reason for learning, creating a learning agenda, having learning questions. And then the other part is looking at our systems and saying, do our systems support us in learning? And
Mhm.
that can look like looking at your M&E system and saying, is learning showing up in the way we are collecting data, in the way that we are communicating with the people that we are engaging? Is learning showing up in that system? And then the other thing I can mention now as well is really the practices within the program or within the organization. Do we have practices that support learning? And that touches a little bit about the culture of learning, which I'm sure we may discuss as we move on. But those are just some of the basic things that I'm saying. I think if I saw them within a team, when it's very intentional, then I would say we are doing some type of learning.
Thank you for sharing that. I have to admit, I'm I'm always excited about my guests and like the conversations we have, but I'm particularly excited to talk to you at this point in time because in my own evaluation journey, I lead a team of research and
Mhm.
evaluation in a health authority in Canada, and my evaluation practice has been, I would say, like moving a little bit more and more towards learning through the evaluation capacity building work that I've been doing. And some of the things that you've shared, I'm like, oh, I'm doing that right now. Right now, I'm working on implementing our learning agenda. Right now, I'm
Yep.
working on, we're developing new workflows and processes, and evaluation and monitoring is very embedded within that. But I'm asking these questions about learning and do they actually support the process of answering our questions and having a reflection time and all of that. So I'm very excited to hear more about the examples and what that can look like because I already have some ideas from the things you've written that I'd love to hear a little bit more about. So just wanted to share that. So excited.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that you've introduced us a little bit to in that description is the role of a learning practitioner versus the role of a monitoring and evaluation practitioner.
Yeah.
How commonly are you seeing the existence of this practitioner within monitoring and evaluation and learning teams? And what do you think is getting in the way of us really putting in place the resources and supports required for learning to happen?
So, one thing I will say is the incentives, right? So the first question is, where are the incentives for teams, for programs, for organizations to invest in learning? This first question. Because as most of us know, we're in this field, when you talk about monitoring and evaluation, it's something that a lot of people are very familiar with, right? From the public sector, most of our donors' mandates, we have monitoring and evaluation systems. We can't really speak to the quality of all of them, but at least it's something that organizations will say, we feel like this is something that is essential. When it comes to learning, I would say people have an idea of why it's important. So when we are having a conversation with different people, even people who do not invest in learning at all, and by learning here, I'm saying structured learning, because I know I get a lot of pushback when I speak about learning, and people tell me, we are always learning, we learn every day. And I'm like, that's great. But if that knowledge or that understanding that you're getting from doing your work, if it's not shared, if it's not documented, if we don't use those learnings to stop doing the same mistakes over and over in our sector, then we are not learning. When I talk about people being interested in the idea of learning, I think the interest is there and there seems to be an understanding, but the incentives for us to be very intentional and to plan for learning, I would say that is missing in most cases. Yeah.
I'm curious, building off of that, how have you been able to create support if you've ever been in a situation where this was required for learning to be resourced?
Yeah. So I was lucky enough early in my career when I really wanted to transition to the learning part, although I was embedded in the monitoring and evaluation team, which I do consider myself a MEL professional all around. But I think I use my voice to really advocate for learning because it's important to the work that we do. And I was lucky enough to work in a program that was funded by a donor who cared about learning. I know we can use different words. I think care is a strong word, but what I will say is the donor had systems and processes in place that ensured that learning was not optional for us as a
Mm,
program. And that meant the resources were availed for us to have a whole like learning team within my program. And that's when I started leading learning within a program, because the resources were there in terms of the finances, but also I worked with great program leaders who valued learning. So the fact that we had resources and we had leadership support, that's what I needed to really focus my efforts into figuring out what that means for us, and then pushing forward a lot of the initiatives around learning in the program.
definitely. One thing that you're making me reflect on that you said in the last part is defining what learning means to us. And I think within the field of monitoring and evaluation, we tend to assume that learning has a universal definition, and like everyone we work with will see learning in the same way. And I have an interesting experience because I work in the health sector where the concept of learning health systems is becoming
Yeah.
very popular and kind of a hype word. But when you look at where that concept came from, it's not coming from the monitoring and evaluation field, it's coming
Mm.
from other professions and fields. And how they define it and conceptualize it is quite different to a lot of the things that you talk about. So
Yeah.
I like that emphasis on one of the first things you need to do when you have that support and people are prioritizing and care about it. It is still important to have that definition of, okay, then what is this going to mean for us and in our context?
Exactly. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And unlike a lot of the other subject matters, then learning, it's still something that we do have to define, right? So we do have definitions that are existing that are very theoretical to most of us. I come into this field as a practitioner. I never went to school to study monitoring, evaluation, or learning. All of them are things where I've had to work under people who really understand the concept. Of course, do a lot of work, academic certificates, and all that. But my lens has always been a lens of a practitioner. I look at myself as someone who just cares about solving development problems. And I'm always asking questions to figure out how I can be helpful because I'm in this space. So when it comes to learning, I apply the same lens. I want to hear from the team. How would learning look like for you? What does that mean for you? Of course, we do need a starting point, and there are things, I think, for me, I consider them principles that I hold on what learning means. But then when it comes to how do we operationalize this, then all that has to be defined by the team that is working on this. And I can share a little bit about the principle. I think very quickly, one of the things that I emphasize is that learning is a process. And I emphasize this because I have been in spaces where people have told me, we have a learning event. Can you come help us? Because this is us doing learning. And when you ask a couple of questions, you realize there's really not a lot of thought behind that event or that workshop or that presentation or that review meeting. That's really not learning. Learning is a process, and we need to think about it in totality from the beginning to the end. And then another thing is it has to be intentional. It's not something that we are adding on to everything that we are doing. Um, I think I'm allowed to say this here because we have a lot of evaluators listening to us. But also for evaluators, learning is not having a report that has lessons learned and recommendations at the end, or that one presentation that you give to the team before your contract is signed off. That's definitely not it. That's not to say that it's the role of the evaluators, right, to do everything. But I think it's how we communicate when we are in these spaces that is very useful. So we need to communicate clearly that it's a process and it has to be very intentional and, of course, very well researched.
And it could be perhaps shifting the conversations from, okay, as an evaluator, I'll come in, I'll do this report, I'll leave, to actually asking questions like, how is your team going to learn from this? What else do you need from
Exactly.
me to facilitate that process? I like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned was around being a practitioner, learning this while doing the work. And one
Yes.
of the things that I'm very interested in is how evaluators can use the competencies frameworks in evaluation to grow their careers, to develop career development plans. And one thing that I was reflecting on as I was preparing for this episode is that facilitating learning is not a component or a skill in any of the competencies that I have seen. You have facilitation skills and you have reporting skills, which you already mentioned.
Yes.
That's not the same as learning, but you don't have facilitating learning recognized as being a part of the competencies required to do our work. What competencies do you think could help evaluators bridge that gap and step more into supporting learning processes?
Yeah, that's a great observation, Maria. And I think the starting point is what you said. When we look at the evaluation competencies, we do have facilitation, but a lot of us mistake that to mean actually the skills you need to support people with sense making, which is what you need when it comes to learning. Because for learning, there is an end goal. You are supporting a group of people to collectively make sense of whatever findings that you have, to make sense of the data. But the intention is for them to take an action based on that. So, when it comes to the facilitation, we have to think about facilitation in the sense making space and what that looks like. And one of the things that I actually learned as I was doing some of the research for my newsletter is a word that is a sentence that really stuck with me was, we should move from facilitating for consensus to facilitating for equity. And ideally is you're not there to make sure people just come to a consensus and say, let's move on, but you are facilitating a conversation where you want different perspectives to be heard and to be considered, right? And when we are really talking about evidence and data and findings, that's what we need. We need people to bring their different perspectives, and we need to have that conversation on what does this mean for us as people collectively, and what is the implication of this, right? We're not going to take a segue of defining what evidence is and the evidence sources, but also really acknowledging the lived experiences of people in the room is very key to how you facilitate. So I think that's one thing I would add to the list of competencies. Another thing is also power aware communication. So when we get into the space of learning, we're not just sharing information, we're really looking to influence. We are looking to influence, and we know every time we have the word influence, we are really thinking about the power dynamics. So, who are the decision makers that you want to influence? And how does that look like? If you are a young evaluator in your organization, and by young here, I mean in terms of hierarchy, not age, where you are in your organization, if you're in a space where you are not at a space where you can have peer conversations with people who hold the power and who make decisions, then what skills do you need to build to be able to use your position to influence the decisions that those people are going to make, in most cases when you're not even in that room? So there is that power communication thing that we really need to take into consideration. And then the other skill I would mention is adaptive leadership skills. This is something that we need to consider a lot because learning has very little to do with technical expertise and tools. It has everything to do with people, because you're pushing people to change behaviors. And for that, you need adaptive skills. You need the curiosity. You need to figure out, how do I get people engaged? You need the critical thinking skills. You need to be aware of the people around you and what they prioritize and what they don't. And at what time do you intervene to make sure that you're in a position to influence the decisions? Yeah.
I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I want to try to stick to the not go all over the place. The
Yes.
first thing I want to say is I'm very glad you brought up the first competency around also leveraging loved experiences. I've read on your newsletter that's something you call tacit knowledge, and how
Yes.
it can sometimes have a bit of a tension between the monitoring and evaluation way of training and thinking and seeing evidence as being these specific things, when tacit knowledge can also play such an important role in the learning process. So I'm glad
Mm-hmm.
that you brought that up, because I think it's important for evaluators to reflect on that as well. The last piece that you mentioned around adaptive leadership, I'm so glad that you defined it in this space. And just want to add to that that I really like the adaptive part into that, like leadership skills. Because what I always tell people that are stepping into management or that are expanding their scope into leading people is that the challenging thing about being a leader is that you can develop these skills and techniques and tools, but what works with one person is not going to work with the other person necessarily. And as a leader, you need to develop the rapport and trust to understand what works for the people you're leading, and
Yep.
be adaptive to try different things.
Yes.
So I find it interesting to see how the parallels apply in your learning work when you are
Yep.
leading learning spaces. Okay, so I know that you've already mentioned some of the competencies that people interested in stepping into learning can develop and skills they can build, especially if they're not in spaces where they're having conversations that could influence decisions. Could you maybe introduce us to some of the tools or processes that you commonly use, so that people can have a bit more of a concrete idea of what embedding this into the way that they work could look like?
Great. So the starting point is figuring out what does the team want to learn. I know that can be a very open-ended question, but we do have a lot of resources on how to create a learning agenda. That is always the starting point for a lot of teams that I work with and that I support. I will also say for evaluators, we are trained to think about evaluation questions as the first thing. Like you come in, you're like, cool, let me get my evaluation questions right. That's okay. But also, one thing that we need to do is to start thinking about learning questions, because those can look very different from evaluation questions, right? So, evaluation has its space. We know what the value of evaluation is, we know the value add in development, but also we keep having discussions about how evaluations are not being used, right? And when it comes to just the evaluator, we have a lot of great evaluators who are technically sound. So it has nothing to do with the methodologies that we are using. But then that means it's probably a systemic problem, and we have to think wider beyond just us as the evaluators. We need to think about the decision makers, the people who commission the evaluators. And if we think about them and we center the users in our approaches, then we do need to think about how to come up with learning questions. So,
Can you give
moving
me
on.
an example? Can you give me an
Right.
example of, in a project, what could an evaluation question look like versus a learning question?
Yes, that is a great question. And before I give the example, I'll actually start by explaining what a learning question is, because I know a lot of us struggle a little bit on defining that. A learning question is a question that helps teams make better decisions, especially during the implementation period. So my philosophy when I am speaking about learning, it's always tied to learning for a purpose. And in most cases, we want to learn so that we can use those learnings during the implementation period of the program to improve the work that we are doing. So a learning question is a question that, when answered, will help the team improve what they're doing at that particular time. And we know that, on the other hand, evaluation questions are really helping us to judge our work, right? Are we being effective? And they're looking back at the work that we have done, and they're asking, have we done that well? Which is good. But when it comes to the learning question, we are more forward looking, not just asking, have we done that well, but we're also asking, what can we do better in this time that we are working on a program? So, an example that I will give at a program level for an evaluation question, we may be interested in understanding to what extent did our program or a specific intervention contribute to the change of a household income, for example, right? But for a learning question, I can be very specific in asking what particular intervention or what particular activity in this specific intervention actually contributed to income household, and to what group specifically among all the different participant groups or beneficiary groups that I want. And I'm asking this because I have the intention of making a decision on how to allocate my resources to the different groups. So I would say that's one simple example, but every time we hear learning questions, let's think about the decision that will be informed by the answer that comes to it. And also, just to add a point, that I know evaluations can serve a dual purpose, right? Accountability purpose and learning purpose. But if we as evaluators just focus on asking evaluation questions as they are, where we are only looking at what happened and how well we performed, then sometimes we miss the forward looking element that really help us to figure out what are we going to change if we want to improve our outcomes. That's
Hmm.
how I would frame it.
Yeah, I love that. So I will include in the episode notes some of the newsletters where you'll go more in depth into and you provide tools to track
Yes.
decisions and document also throughout the evaluation process and throughout the program process what decisions are made, why, and what evidence used. I love the practicality of those tools. So for the audience, if you're interested in learning more about how to start moving more towards focusing on decisions, you will find the links on the episode notes. Going back to the question, what do you have any other suggestions or
Yeah.
tools, processes, and what that might look like?
Yes. So I think we started with having a clear learning agenda and then thinking about how you're going to gather that evidence. So for a lot of monitoring and evaluation specialists, I know we do have our routine ways of collecting data, but when it comes to learning, we need to expand our evidence sources, right? So we need to start thinking about observation, has to be something that you think about. You have to start thinking about tacit knowledge, like how does that even get to you? Because we don't have a lot of defined processes for us to actually make sure that is included in our systems. So we need to broaden our thinking in terms of what evidence is within our system. And then after that, I think one very critical thing, of course, is really the sense making. So, how do you create processes where you can bring people together and facilitate some type of session where people can make sense of the data or the evidence that you put on the table? And just shouting out triangulation here because it's very important. So, we're not saying have a meeting where you have one evaluation report and people are only looking at that and trying to make sense of it. We are saying bring in your monitoring data. The program has been doing monitoring way before the evaluation happened. So bring in all these different sources of data, put people together, make sure when you put people together, you have the people who are actually doing the work on the ground. I do insist this a lot in the work that I do, that you need the people at the front line to be there when you're doing that sense making and interpretation of what the information means, because that's where the tacit knowledge is, and we need it to make conclusive statements about what the data or what the evidence means for the program. So that period on how do you translate the data is very important. And then the other thing that a lot of us are not engaged in, but it's very essential, is that part on how do we then translate that insight into an action. And that is really everything to do with decision making processes, which is a whole sector by itself when it comes to decision making. But we need to ask ourselves questions as MEL practitioners, as MEL professionals, as evaluators. What is your role in bridging that gap? And we have a lot of tools that can help you guide decision makers to start thinking about how do I make sure that I'm actually using the evidence and the data that has been provided as I make decisions.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And I think it paints more of a picture of how that can look differently from your traditional monitoring and evaluation process, where the focus is on a report, submitting that report, and then moving on to the next thing. I'd love to transition now for you to share about your Learn, Adapt, Manage network, what it is. People are going to find, again, the link on the episode notes. There's a lot of amazing content there, but I would love to hear how you started this, what it is, what you have learned through the process.
Yeah. So LAM is, so it stands for Learn, Adapt, Manage. There's a lot packed in there. But in one sentence, I would say LAN exists to support practitioners to practice learning. That's it. I founded LAM because I was a practitioner who was trying to figure out what learning means and what it looks like in my work. So I remember the first LinkedIn article that I wrote before I launched LAM was actually me trying to explain to my family what I do for work. And I was talking about I'm still working, and my dad, may his soul rest in peace, used to tell people that I do statistics because he knew that I was good in mathematics. So I was trying to really explain and say, not really, I just don't see it and work with numbers all the time, although there is some numbers in what I do. And as part of that family joke, I think that's how I ended up with my first article, where I was explaining my work as a learning practitioner, what I do on a day-to-day basis. What I gave a lot of detail about some work that I was doing, where the program that I was working for, we had this huge learning workshop, and I took people behind the scenes on how I actually designed the workshop and how long it takes for me to design a workshop that I know is going to be very critical to the team, because they were going into work planning for the following year. And I wanted to make sure that work plan is informed by the evidence that we've gathered in the previous year. So in that process, I think there was a lot of interest for a lot of people who are also in the same space and trying to figure out. They're like, oh, this is interesting. And that's how LAM was born. It was essentially just a platform where I was sharing about what I'm doing and some of the tools that I'm using, and also things that are not working really a lot. Because I'm a MEL professional, it is very heavy on what can we do to operationalize the L in MEL, because that is the space that I was in. And now it's way broader and wider. We have a lot of people from our space, we have a lot of researchers, we have a lot of communications people, and we have a lot of program managers who are just like, I want to understand this, because some part of me tells me it's important, but when it comes to how do I actually make sure it's happening for my program, it becomes a little bit difficult. So that's LAM. And for people who are a bit new to it, we have a lot of content creation. So I do a lot of content creation on LinkedIn. This is through the newsletter that we have that comes out twice per month, and also a lot of posts, but also a lot of curation from so many other wonderful people who have invested a lot of time into thinking about learning, especially from academic perspective. But then when it comes to how do we translate this theory to practice, there is a gap. So LAM just exists to try out that theory and say, this is what we have tried, this is what's working, these are some of the things that are not really working, and we need a better way of doing this. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I think that the little thing Florence didn't add is that Lam has 8,000 subscribers, which is amazing and speaks very loudly to
Thank
the
you.
value of the content that you're putting out there. I was reading through it to prepare for this episode, and I already have ideas and examples that I can adopt in my own practice, like pause and reflect sessions, and
Yes.
the practicality of it and how you walk people through this is how you could do it yourself is something I appreciate. So just wanted to say congratulations. I love the work
Thank
you're
you.
putting out there. And thank you so much for agreeing to be here and learning and sharing with us what learning really looks like in our monitoring and evaluation work. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to add or share with our listeners?
I would like to first appreciate you for having me. It's always great to have conversations about learning and what that looks like in our sector. And to everyone listening, I think I'm just trying to pass a message here to say, let's think about the work that we are doing in this sector. And if we want to really contribute to solving development and humanitarian problems, then we can't ignore the importance of not just generating evidence, but actually using that evidence. And no matter what you're doing in the sector, you have a role to play when it comes to encouraging the use of evidence to inform how we design programs, how we adapt them during the implementation period, and how we transition during closeout. Yeah, and the last quote that I will leave you with is that learning is less about the tools and the methodologies, it's all about people. It's all about people because you're trying to influence behavior change. You're trying to influence how people make decisions. So think about the people always.
I love that. Thank you so much, Florence.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you follow the Valuation Couch on Apple and Spotify podcasts. I'm here to help you build the valuation career that you deserve. Make sure you follow me on LinkedIn, where I share more career tips and resources.